Hello there, welcome to Saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. And welcome to Resident Evil month on Saberduelgaming. This month marks the 30th anniversary of the first Resident Evil game. And across this month, we're going to be doing a lot of Resident Evil content. When the Nintendo GameCube was graced with the remake of the original Resident Evil in 2002, it sparked a resurrection, so to speak, in the fanbase. It would soon be followed later that year by Resident Evil 0, which was not quite as well received. However, little did people know that the Nintendo GameCube was about to take Resident Evil in a whole new direction with the next entry in the franchise. Something that would change everything. Welcome to our retro review of Resident Evil 4. When Resident Evil 4 was first announced, the one thing that everyone latched onto was the fact that Leon Kennedy was finally making a comeback. Leon is a fan favourite in the franchise and hadn't been seen since the original Resident Evil 2 back on the PlayStation. However, other than that, it was all change across the board. First of all, the setting. Instead of being in Raccoon City, or at least an Umbrella facility like we'd seen in Code Veronica, we were instead venturing out into a undisclosed European village, assumed to be in rural Spain. Leon was also being sent on a specific mission, which is kind of a change from Resident Evil. We were being sent to rescue the President's daughter from a bunch of fanatics that had kidnapped her, and we're using, instead of the T or C virus, Las Plagas, this strange living parasite that turned people into easily controlled monsters. And here was one of the biggest changes again: no zombies. The people were under a control of this Las Plagas, but they weren't actually dead. No zombies in a Resident Evil game? That was a major change. But the biggest change was in the gameplay. Resident Evil games had always had a very specific look and feel. They tended to use mostly fixed camera angles, where you saw the room from one position, you walked around, and occasionally then the camera angle might change. Games like Code Veronica gave a little bit more movement around it, but on the whole, they tended to stick to that. Resident Evil 4? Completely different. This was an open world that you could fully explore and look at from any angle or position you wanted. It also moved away from the fixed camera angles Resident Evil was famous for. You saw the world from over Leon's shoulder and zoomed in a little bit when you were aiming at your targets. This effectively moved it away from being a survival horror game and made it more of an action game with survival and horror elements. You could run out of ammo, and there was certainly some horror moments in there, but it was much more of an action game. In line with this, the game introduced quick time events, and quite a few of them, in which it would cut to something of a cinematic, and you would have to hit certain buttons in order to survive that cinematic or lead Leon to do the next motion within the story. We still had something similar to safe rooms in that there would be typewriters that you could save on, but you didn't need to use ribbons. You could save as many times as you wanted. One of the most controversial things we'd seen in Resident Evil 0 was the lack of save boxes for you to keep items in and magically find them in a completely different room in a similar box. This was also missing from this game. However, unlike 0, where you always had to go back to where to find them, you didn't really put items down. If you did, you lost them. Instead, you had a massive Hitachi case that, for some reason, you can't see on Leon, and as you went through the game, you were able to expand the size of it, giving you bigger and bigger capacity. It actually left it so that Leon could carry a whole arsenal of weapons throughout the game. All of this kept the focus on one thing: high-octane action, and Resident Evil 4 did that very, very well. Whilst the story didn't directly link to the previous stories, it still linked to that idea of bioterrorism. We also got to see cameos of other characters that we'd seen previously, such as Ada Wong, and a character that very clearly references Wesker. We also have Ashley Graham as our secondary character. Soon into the game, we manage to rescue her, and from this point on, the aim is to try and keep her safe. You can tell her to wait, follow you, and at times, tell her to hide, so that she's less at risk while you engage in fighting. There is one brief period where you have to play as her for a level, and this offers a completely different challenge. She has no weapons, instead you just have to survive. This actually feels like the most survival horror part of the game, and it would be a little bit of a foreshadow for some of the game mechanics we'd see going forward in the Resident Evil franchise. An unarmed person running around trying to survive with nothing but a torch. Puzzles did remain within the game, but they were a lot more simple, so people that loved that aspect probably struggled a little with this. The game also included moments where you effectively had a rifle range, a game within the game. It didn't quite make any sense, but it was fun. We also have, of course, the Merchant, a man who mysteriously appears at random points through the game, asking what are you buying and what are you selling, trying to sell you items and weapons. Again, it makes no sense whatsoever, but I suppose this effectively replaces the magic boxes that transport your items from A to B. It might not make sense, but he actually became quite an iconic character. Whilst the game is definitely visually quite different from the other Resident Evil games in location, it does still manage to capture a very similar Resident Evil-esque vibe. It's a lot more gothic and retro in its stylized design, but it still feels like Resident Evil despite so much of what I've said sounding anything but. Especially elements when we're inside castles and inside laboratory scenes, it definitely still hits that Resident Evil vibe. Some of the monsters and characters you will come up against are absolutely gruesome and rival any of the tyrants, nemesis, or any of the previous animals and creatures you've come across before. It even pays homage to Resident Evil past in scenes such as this, which clearly are meant to reference the iconic Jill sandwich scene. We continue to have the first aid sprays, the herbs, and in this game there's even a new type of herb which allows you to expand your maximum health, which you can also do for Ashley. Overall, the fact that it was so different to the other Resident Evil games really left it in a place where it was quite vulnerable. If people didn't like what they changed it into, then there was going to be massive issues. But before we look at how people did view it at the time, the one thing they had in their favour was that what they did differently, they did very, very well. The quick time events were very functional, and unlike we'd see in some of the later Resident Evil games, they weren't awkward, they didn't get in the way, they tended to work exactly as you would want them to. The cutscenes were beautiful and very cinematic, and whilst the game's focus to a much more horror action base was not going to be for everybody, it did what it did exceptionally well. The action within this game is still tense. It's not just action for the sake of action, it still feels creepy. It's eerie the moment the traps are set off and capture people. Whilst you're trying to free your friend, you can feel the tension of someone bearing down upon you. The monsters, the visuals, the sound especially, sets the scene perfectly. And whilst it's so different to Resident Evil, it's still so undeniably Resident Evil. So all that being said, how was it received when it was first released back in 2005? Well, let's not mince words. This game got universal acclaim. No matter who reviewed this game, it got between the equivalent of 90 and on multiple occasions 100%. Hell, if rounding up, it'll be 100% every time. And on just my initial search alone, I found 8 different references of it winning Game of the Year, along with a whole host of other gaming awards that it won, far too many for me to reference in this review. And sales reflected this. In just the first 20 days, in North America alone, 320,000 copies of the game were sold. The European release was just as successful, with all 200,000 copies allocated sold within the first month. By 2007, 1.6 million copies of this game had been sold, and that is only the Nintendo GameCube versions. That's not even factoring in ports onto the PlayStation 2 and later onto the Nintendo Wii. It even got a place in the Guinness Book of Records for the best-selling survival horror game back in 2012. So whether we're talking about critical reception, awards, or sales, this game cleaned house right across the board when it first came out and in the years since, especially when you factor in how many times it's been re-released with only minor tweaks. It goes to show this was a game that people kept wanting to play. But what about now? How does the original Resident Evil 4 stack up to modern scrutiny? Well, I could not be more perfectly placed to speak on this. I played the original version back on the Nintendo GameCube when it first came out. After, tragically, my GameCube and games were stolen, I made sure that when I rebought a GameCube, I actually bought the Resident Evil 4 edition with the chainsaw control pad and, of course, a new copy of Resident Evil 4, all of which I still have to this day. That said, I never really replayed it. Until recently, when I replayed it as an ongoing live stream on my channel. You can go and check that out if you want to. And I played it through to completion, and playing it again now, it was just as enjoyable as the first time. In fact, quite frankly, I was amazed how good the game was, despite having very high standards and expectations for it. Whether we're talking about when I first played it or now, I had every reason to struggle with this game. I was a massive fan of the original Resident Evil style of play, and I'm obsessed with zombies. So the fact that this game moved so dramatically away from that really could have costed me as a fan, but it really didn't. The gameplay within this was so good, the storyline so captivating, the environment so fitting, and the characters so enjoyable and believable, that even though it moved somewhat away from Resident Evil, it did it in a way that still felt like it honoured Resident Evil. It felt like an evolution rather than a change, and eventually, things do have to change, even though that's something I'm not necessarily a fan of. One aspect in the gameplay that I found a little bit tricky initially, but now going back to play it I realise how perfectly done it was the quick time events. These interactive cutscenes where you have to quickly press a button for the desired response were something that I'd never really seen in a game before, and initially I didn't quite get it. However, as the game progresses, they really help make the game feel more like a true story. We would see these going forward in Resident Evil 5 and 6, for example, and at no point since have they ever done them as effectively as they did in this game. In fact, every other time they've done them, they've led to real issues in the game, often with them being quite glitchy, or sometimes just really getting in the way of the game's flow. Having played Resident Evil 5 and 6 quite recently, going back to Resident Evil 4 and playing the quick time events in this game, they're like a breath of fresh air. I don't know why more recent games haven't been able to do them as effectively as this game did. I really love the dialogue in this game as well. This to me is effectively peak dialogue in a Resident Evil game, whereas some of the earlier games the voice acting was, let's say, corny as opposed to awful. And in some of the recent ones, the dialogue's just become a bit too serious. This captured that perfect middle ground. It was corny enough to feel like Resident Evil, but serious enough to feel believable. What was interesting with Resident Evil 4 was that on replaying it, there are aspects of the game that I remembered as being really annoying that actually weren't. Most notable in this was that young lady there, Ashley. If you had asked me before I replayed the game what she was like in this game, I would have described her as the one real annoyance in the game. That she was always making the game unplayable. And that's just not true. Quite frankly, a good 50% of the time she's not even there, but when she is, she's really not that annoying. The idea that her character is constantly being kidnapped is just not the case. First of all, she's controllable. She will stop and follow as and when you ask her to. And realistically, I only found a few times that she got captured, and it wasn't directly my own fault. Plus, the whole story of the game is that we're rescuing this 20-year-old girl. It makes sense that she's going to be captured, and of course, we have to protect her. What was interesting as well is the one particular level where you play directly as her and you're unarmed using nothing but a torch. That was a much more difficult level, and actually it was in many ways the template for what many Resident Evil games and survival horror games would be like going forward. A lot more creepy, chasing around in the dark with nothing but a torch. For me, quite frankly, this is where Resident Evil peaked. I don't think any of the Resident Evil games since have been anywhere near as good as this one, and whilst many of the games continue to use this type of gameplay, Resident Evil 5 and 6 for example, neither of them are close to the game that Resident Evil 4 is, at least in my humble opinion. I will quickly comment on the remake of Resident Evil 4 also. Whilst Resident Evil 2 and 3 being remade, I totally understood. The graphical difference between the PlayStation and the consoles now are huge, so I understand why that leap forward would be made, even if I am not necessarily a fan of the gameplay choices. Resident Evil 4, on the other hand, the gameplay is a perfect example of modern gaming. The graphics are still fantastic. I really don't think that was a game that needed to be made, but that said, I'm not going to critique it. I'm sure it's a fantastic game, and having not played it fully, I can't really comment on it. What I will say is that the graphical quote-unquote improvements, in my opinion, actually make for a much uglier game. I don't know why. It just doesn't quite look as nice as this game does. But I accept that's very much just a personal opinion. I don't say this very often, but Resident Evil 4, it's a perfect game. If you like this kind of game, there is not really anything in it that you can't like, and it stands up just as well now as it did when it was first released. Anyone playing this version of the game cannot complain about graphics, gameplay, sound, anything. Even after its own rebirth with the remake of Resident Evil, the Resident Evil franchise was starting to wane and needed something fresh. Resident Evil 4 gave it that, and whilst none of the games that followed it ever quite lived up to that standard in my opinion, this game was exceptional. I can't think of any reason to give this game a score any lower than 10 out of 10. There is nothing that can be improved, nothing that could be changed, nothing that I would do differently in this game. It's absolutely outstanding, and I genuinely do believe it's the best Resident Evil game ever made. It's certainly where the franchise peaked in my opinion, and I don't think anything since has ever quite lived up to this. I know this is a lot longer video than I normally do for my retro reviews, so I want to thank you very much for watching it. Please comment below what your thoughts and opinions are on this game, and keep watching this month for more Resident Evil content. And if you're especially excited by Resident Evil 4, go and check out the live stream on my channel where I complete the whole game. And until next time, as always, take the high ground.